So friends, in the second part of the lecture, Professor Payal Nagpal will dwell upon the themes that she has touched, in the lecture so far, and the ordinariness, the simplicity, the spontaneity that is focused on, I think will also expand in its scope to cover larger areas of life, and the poem appears to be lyrical, through working through prose, through prose constructions, and that's the beauty of the ordinary life, that people live, and particularly women. They are, devoid of many facilities and conveniences, and yet they make do with whatever it is, because as Professor Payal Nagpal said, mostly they are good, and they have lived that kind of a life, and they accept it, but they definitely don't rave about it. They cannot rave about it because there is nothing dramatic about this kind of poetry, but there is something very strongly and deeply humanistic about it, and that's what Professor Payal Nagpal seems to be indicating. So over to you again, Professor Payal Nagpal. And
thank you, Professor Prakash. So carrying on from this idea of observation and what she sees, and bringing the domestic in a sense within poetry. So here are, for instance, to touch upon the same theme, like bean eaters, she writes a poem called Kitchenette Building, and these are just a few lines from Kitchenette Building. But could a dream send up through onion fumes its white and violet fight with fried potatoes? And yesterday, so this of course gives us a very good sense, of onion fumes and potatoes. Of course, the food is simple, but immediately it changes. And yesterday's garbage ripening in the hall, flutter or sing an aria down these rooms. Even if we were willing to let it in, had time to warm it, keep it very clean, anticipate a message, let it begin. So, a lot of these images are actually there. So, one of the things that Gwendolyn Brooks' poetry does is it ensures that, and writing at the time that she does, that these events from day-to-day life are more eventful than any kind of mega event. So it's not as if something big is to happen to be captured in poetry. The poetry itself has to reflect on the ordinariness of life. The everyday is a part of, because it's also important, writing from the Afro-American context, she's also in a sense challenging the hegemonic view or an understanding of poetry as an entirely different kind of creative writing. So here is a poem titled We Real Cool. So here in this lecture we will also be looking at one or two short poems, and also a significant just a little bit about a very significant long poem that she had written. So in We Real Cool, again, these are probably youngsters. The pool players, it's a very short poem. The pool players, 7 at the golden shovel. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. So I think where we were talking about painting, the poem appearing like a painting, this one is like probably jazz itself. It's like music itself, and so the rhythms, in terms of the style of Gwendolyn Brooks, rhythm is very important. There's a kind of music, and here again, music and rhythm about the most ordinary things here. So this is probably, and in the words of Gwendolyn Brooks herself, who had, in an interview talked about this particular poem, she says, they have no pretensions to quote Brooks, they have no pretensions to glamour, they are supposedly dropouts, or at least they are in the pool room when they should possibly be in school. The we, you are supposed to stop after. Actually, as you can see, each line in the stanza, it ends, with a full stop, and then there is we at the end of the sentence. And then the second line again begins with something else, full stop, and then there is we. So, the we, you are supposed to stop after the we and think about their validity. And of course, there is no way for you to tell whether it should be said softly or not. I suppose, but I say it rather softly because I want to represent their basic uncertainty, which they don't bother to question every day, of course. This is Brooks herself on this particular poem. So in this light, if we look at this poem again, so if we are looking at school dropouts or students who should actually be in school but are at a pool, so they are obviously not following the rule of kind of going in for a career later and so on, and they're just sitting here and they're just playing pool. We real cool, we left school. We lurk late, we strike straight. So they have left school, they just roam around late, they strike straight, they sing sin. They're probably doing things that the parents or their school would not expect them to do. We thin gin, jazz June, we die soon. So what is the life? The question, with a constant emphasis on we, Brooks is raising the question about what happens to these children, what happens to them when they are in these districts where they do not follow, in a sense, the so-called hegemonic career graft. What happens to them then? So here again, I'd like to request Professor Prakash to share his views on this poem that's written in a very, and Brooks is known for her style also of writing poetry, which is very different.
I was thinking about, your use of they. These children, they say we, and you are saying they. So, this seems to be the intention of the author, to, empathize with these children at the same time, then about the citizen who would always call them they. But it's very touching that the face of the child, comes out and starts with we, and then they don't know what to do. So therefore, one has to go to the next line where the description is given, and finally there is a full stop, as you said, very rightly, very emphatically, and then immediately after that they come back to themselves. They say we. So which means they will not say die. They would always say we live on. We will carry on, and it ends with we'll die soon. But then they say if they die soon, then next line also is going to be we. So they will remain, and they have that kind of effort to carry on in life, even though they know that no success is going to visit them. So this is a very strange kind of poem, and I think it has a lot of musicality about it, because rhythm, as you say, is created by the word we at the end of each line, and I can hear a beat behind it also, the beat of the drum, that when they say we, then the entire thing, the entire atmosphere, the sound pattern changes. So these are things that occur to me after your evocative reading of the poem.
So I also felt that somewhere there is also a question that Brooks is raising, because here the pool players, 7 of them at the Golden Shovel, and it ends with jazz June, we die soon. And here I think she's also raising the question about social responsibility, that when we talk about, it's very subtle, it's very probably at the subtextual level, but the point that emerges, one doesn't know whether Brooks really intended it to, but the point that emerges is that what about social responsibility as far as these children are concerned, who for some reason are not going to school, they are either dropouts. Is it a question of money? Is it a question of what really happens to them? One doesn't know, but there are a lot of questions that this poem raises, and also raises about the life pattern that these children have. Lurking late. So, striking straight, of course, alliterative and emphatic and so on. But one asks about, why is it that this happens? I think that is the question, the uncertainty that the characters in this poem have about themselves, the we that is the uncertainty that is generated also, I think, in the reader in reading these lines, where we wonder, if this is so and we know that this is so, why is this so? And why is it that there is no sense of responsibility towards these children? So I think, this is, again, like you said, this is strange, and this is a very different poem from the safe domestic space in which at least the beans are there, to moving outside of that domestic space, to looking at, and this is the youth. So there is one direction in which the youth coming from, the privileged lot is going to follow, and there is also this youth that does not have the requisite amenities. So these are, in a sense, very important, and critics have focused on this. So, for example, Thorson, in writing about her poetry about Gwendolyn Brooks, says that Brooks depicts individual and private experience as a sphere of black agency. And here the word agency is very important. So we are talking about domestic, experience within the domestic space, experience that belongs to the individual, its private experience, and through her writing, it gives the blacks a certain agency. And so she says, Thorson says that Brooks depicts individual private experience as a sphere of black agency with, broad, implications. For instance, like the old couple in the Bean Eaters raises questions of hunger and poverty. There is a character, Pepita, who is, this is from the long poem that we are briefly going to look at, which is titled In the Mecca. And this is, there's a character, Pepita.
Before you take up the next poem, let me say something about the previous poem, where I was focusing upon the word we, and you seem to empathize more with the poet. Why did she say this? And therefore there are two perspectives regarding our reading of the poem here as well, because you think about the woman raising questions about these children, and she is interested in them. Therefore, that particular perspective of the woman is there, whereas I was looking at it dramatically and seeing that these children can't be easily succumbed to, can't easily be stopped from being there. So just see the two perspectives, the friends emerging out of the reading of the same poem, that Professor Payal Nagpal will be closer to the poet, and a person like me would be closer to the viewer. So that's the kind of dialectic that emerges when discussion begins.
Yes, so actually, because the poem does not end with we.
Yes.
The we is only before we die soon. So that there is no we after that. So in that sense, I think Brooks is drawing our attention to these children, and they are children who are probably, as I said, following a different life pattern, and it's more she's asking us. In fact, these are her own words. Also, as I said in an interview, that they are thinking about the validity, and of course, there is no way to tell that, she says, but she says that I want to represent their basic uncertainty, which they don't bother to question every day. So it's where does, she's going beyond that in a sense, because she draws our attention to this uncertainty that is there, but she's also raising a question in the process about this uncertainty. Why is it there? So where is the sense of, a kind of responsibility towards
uncertainty
them?
Is the immediate reading. Yes. That should be kept in mind.
That should be kept in mind. And these are, Brooks' own words. So, so there are other characters here. For example, Pepita, who's, the mother is looking for her in an apartment building which is called the Mecca, and Pepita is found dead under a cot. So she's been murdered. So, danger, it points to the dangers of the world for girls. A Bronzeville mother loiters in Mississippi, and meanwhile a Mississippi mother burns bacon, uses the setting of a woman making breakfast to explore the two things, racism and sexism. So these moments, Thorson says, are very important, they are forceful, and they demand that the reader should confront and resist gender, economic and racial oppression. So I think this is a very important takeaway here, because Brooks, in her poetry, which is very simple, and of course there's alliteration, there is a certain rhyme scheme, there is a rhythm, it appears to be lyrical, but we must also note that when something is lyrical, mostly it's also supposed to bring in some kind of happy thoughts. But here, she's using the rhythm, she's using alliteration, using the lyrical to draw our attention to something that is dark. And you know how human civilization in that sense has certainly gone awry in creating these disparities. So gender, economic, and racial oppression, all these three come together in her poetry. So, and of course, Orson says that this is surprising because they locate this confrontation and resistance in domestic space. So, a lot of critics have actually considered her poetry to be different because if she is being subversive, if Brooks is being subversive, is challenging authority, she is doing that from the domestic space and also from the space of the inner life of the of the individuals that she is actually mapping. So this is the unique aspect about Gwendolyn Brooks' own work. So so domestic spaces, private home spaces, and how in that sense, Thorson says that this also creates a kind of idea of the inner nation state, which is very different, and this is very different from the Black Arts movement. So where Brooks, of course, is close to the Black Arts movement, but because she is looking at spaces that we may not consider to be overly political in that sense, these spaces are subtle spaces, and this is where she's locating her poetry and her challenging of authority. So, and this is where she's considered slightly different in a sense, her writing from the Black Arts movement. So, how she attends to, the inner lives, especially of the women, and, how the domestic space. And this is something that BAM, as it's referred to, the Black Arts movement, does not really focus on this. So, which means that we are looking in her poetry also at a very new aesthetic of the way in which these subtle spaces, and these are also everyday spaces, these raise the question of the way in which the contemporary black women poets are going to retain what Thorson calls the political force of the Black Arts movement, but also to turn away from it to more subtle areas. And this is where Gwendolyn Brooks, of course, becomes very important. So here again,
in every phase, and particularly in the phase of the 20th century writing, has to keep to one's individuality. So art movements are conducted by thinkers and other aestheticians, and they are important. But then the writer has to present one's own case, and within those parameters. And she is, as you rightly say, she is responding to that in a very positive fashion, but then she wants to retain that individuality which is there in the ordinary details. So there is an aesthetic, as you say, of the larger kind, and there is an aesthetic of the writer herself, and the two have to be kept as parallel, and they seem to interact with each other. And I think it's a very live imagination. The Gwendolyn Brooks is able to tell very subtle things, as you are using the word subtle, very subtle things about the simple details that she confronts in life.
Absolutely. So, to pose the question that, there are poets who have used the domestic settings. So, what is so different about Brooks' use of the same? It is because, she is using, as Thorson calls it, a very distinct model of radically local black cultural nationalism, is what she calls it. And so that, of course, gives it, a different strategy, different politics in terms of the Black Arts movement. So it is.
Would you also dwell upon this black nationalist argument? Use the term.
So I think it emerges from the Black Arts movement to recognize and to foreground politically the fact that the way in which if we may use the polarity of the blacks versus the whites, the way in which I would call them, the powerful and the hegemonic have actually created spaces and used them. It has not been to the benefit of the blacks at all. So, which is where the Black Arts movement, of course, uses literature, music, and so many things to foreground politically the idea that it is that they exist, that it needs to be acknowledged. And here is where a tangential, in a sense, intervention is made by Brooks, where she says that yes, to be overtly political is one part of it, but she's saying that it's important for poetry to depict the everyday life of the people, for them, for the people who are privileged to see us in that sense, is the point that Brooks makes.
Yes, yes.
So, so here again, she says that in ever smaller circles, from moving as you move from say Bronzeville to people's backyards, from the Mecca building, and that is something we'll be discussing briefly. So how she's taking on these specific spaces, and there are so many voices that emerge. For instance, in the first poem itself, The Bean Eaters, it appears as if the plate that is kept on the creaking table makes a sound. So, of course, there's polyvocality, but there is also, everything is endowed with sound. So, the plate is chipped, so there is a sound there. It is tin, there is a sound there. So, this seems to be very, the words should not be taken as, at the very literal face value. So, these thematic traits are considered to be a celebration of, the black woman's identity and focus on black subjects, and how, Thorson draws our attention to the connection between two important spaces, the domestic space and the public sphere. So, this is where it actually comes from. So, for instance, here, just a very brief, there is this very long poem in almost 50 plus stanzas that she had written. It's called In the Mecca. And In the Mecca was written in 1968. This is after she had attended a conference of black writers in Fisk University in 1967. So it is considered to be a watershed moment that kind of changes the way in which she writes. The Mecca is actually about the Mecca Flats. Very little is known. Archive, speaking in terms of the archives also, there is little that is available, I believe. But the Mecca Flats were originally, they were like a building for the affluent people, and it was constructed somewhere in 1893, where there was some kind of World Fair in Chicago. And in 1911, the owners of this building, they initially had a policy that they will only have all white tenants. But around 1911, because from the south to the north there was this movement of the blacks, and this policy was retracted, and Afro-American families were allowed to rent apartments here. But by 1941, the Mecca Flats were torn down. So she has written this 50 plus stanzaic poem that actually looks into the lives of the blacks who are staying in the Mecca Flats. And how it is actually from the point of view of this woman who is looking for her daughter, and it turns out that the daughter has been murdered. So if one were to actually quote about the Mecca Flats from one of the sites, it was one of the earliest examples of a multi-family dwelling for the wealthy, and it was located only a few blocks from the Prairie Avenue, like the city's original Gold Coast. And a lot of money was spent on the construction. It was a tourist attraction and so on. And gradually it was finally torn down, and all that remained was an unbelievably squalid tenement where thousands actually lived, and it became a symbol for a failure in urban living patterns. So now if we were to look at a poem that is written immediately after, it's titled Boy Breaking Glass. So this is about a boy who's retaliating, who's not really speaking, got what he really wanted, and he throws a stone. And I'll just read the first few lines here. Whose broken window, the poem begins like this: whose broken window is a cry of art. Success that winks aware as elegance, as a treasonable faith, is raw, is sonic, is old-eyed premier, a beautiful flaw and terrible ornament. So this is the only work of art that this boy can envisage, and that is throwing a stone, and the broken window becomes that work of art. So here is resistance, something that is very subtle in her early poetry, but after 1967 we see a very pointed rejection, in a sense, of these hegemonic spaces.
How do you relate this to the earlier poetry? Because this seems to be totally different from what she did all her life.
Yes.
This
So
is the
which
question you are
is
raising.
why I brought in the Mecca, that because in the Mecca is written. So in this particular collection, so there is in the Mecca, and after the Mecca is this. It's interesting that the section's titled After the Mecca. So which clearly means that this boy who's now throwing a stone is also Gwendolyn Brooks making a more pointed statement as compared to her early poetry, which is about, rather not early but pre 1967 poetry, where she's using the domestic spaces. If we compare this to the students who are at the pool, who are dropouts from school, so they are uncertain. But here, in throwing that stone, there is some kind of certainty that is there. There is an action that she has arrived at. So
I also see some connection, because there's a kind of break. Maybe you can call it epistemological break also. In the 1960s, I remember when President Kennedy was murdered, and because he was taking the side of the blacks, then the whites had actually to be blamed for it, and there was an atmosphere of intolerance at that time. I think there seems to be some connection between this poem and that.
absolutely, possibly, which is something also that grows out also of her own interaction, I think, at that conference with a lot of other writers. I think that kind of gives her a different kind of strength to write poetry of this sort. So for example, this boy in this particular poem, the boy breaking glass, he says, the boy in the poem says, and this is in inverted commas, it says, I shall create, if not a note, a whole, if not an overture, a desecration. So, this is the art form you can expect from somebody that, you really pushed people out of the margins and literally swallowed up space for yourself. So, this is
Please
what
conclude
people are
with this,
going
because
to.
I think that, how do you sum up this discussion about the starting with ordinary details of life, then going in a certain direction, and finally becoming so forceful in a different sense.
Yes. So I think Gwendolyn Brooks kind of, in her poetry that is written particularly before 1967, is still looking at articulating her own thoughts and her own observations in a certain sense. But she arrives at a moment where she feels that these thoughts now need to become more pointed. They need to be more poignantly seen and more poignantly understood. And these are people, for example, in this very poem itself, she says, the boy says that, you have thrown me out, and this is all that he has. And he says that he is the one who does not have the rest, what the others have. And what do the others have? Who has not Congress, lobster, love, the Regency room, the Statue of Liberty. So he says that these are things that are not available to him. And so he's speaking from that position of being underprivileged. And Gwendolyn Brooks, in her later poetry, realizes that it's important to make this point as more poignant.
So friends, Professor Payal Nagpal has raised many questions, and she has also talked about the strength of the poem, the poet, in the ordinary ways of life, and finally come to the conclusion that perhaps poetry perforce has to become political in nature. Now you can take your guidance from here. They just go into the ordinary life, go into the details of life, how people survive, but they keep hope alive all the time. And that sometimes one bursts out, and then the poet comes to a social self, which earlier she was hiding very subtly behind the words. So it's a very complex poet. Ultimately, would you like to say something?
Yes, I just like to say that since you raised the question of Brooks' later poetry, so Brooks herself says this about her own later poetry. She says, "They'll deal with people that I know. I want them to be pictures of black life as I see it today." So I think
that's an apt conclusion to the discussion. And thanks so much, Professor Payal Nagpal. And friends, I'm sure that these questions will always keep you going with respect to the poetry, specifically of the black variety in America. Thank you.